What's up, everyone? Father Charles here. Welcome to another episode of Catholic Themes in Tolkien. Today we're going to talk about the theme of friendship. Now, you might be wondering, well, friendship, that's not just a Catholic thing. Well, of course not. Friendship is a universal human experience. It's one of the delights of life. It's one of the things that makes life truly worth living. What we're going to talk about today is how Tolkien had a distinctively Catholic flavor to his idea of friendship, and this became absorbed into the story in a very powerful way. So even a very cursory glance at The Lord of the Rings, even if you just watch the films, for instance, if you've never read the book, or just read the book, on a very surface level, you see that there's an overriding emphasis on friendship. You see Frodo and Sam, you see Merry and Pippin, you see Legolas and Gimli. You see Gandalf as kind of the alliance builder. You might say he's the friendship builder. He's overcoming alienation and division, one of Sauron's chief weapons. On the other hand, you see with the orcs, you see the disunity. You see the alienation. You see the inability for them to enter into anything that resembles true friendship. And so whether it's the argument that ensues when Merry and Pippin escape from different groups of orcs, when they escape from the Uruk-hai, or when basically the orcs all kill each other when Frodo and Sam are on their way to Mount Doom, making it possible for them to fulfill the quest. You see that people may fear Sauron, but they don't love him, and they certainly don't love one another. Whereas the good characters, there's these bonds of friendship that just make the quest possible. And I just think there's something really powerful here going on underneath the hood, if you will. I think it's an operating system of Tolkien, this idea of friendship, this distinctively Catholic view of friendship. For Catholics, we believe that we're created in the image and likeness of a God who is a friendship. The whole Catholic doctrine, Christian doctrine of the Trinity, says that God is not just this isolated, soul entity, but that he's this communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's a love relationship. God is an eternal family. He's an eternal friendship, if you will. And so the Bible tells us that we're created in the image and likeness of God. And so if we're in the image and likeness of a God who is a friendship, who is a communion of persons, well, that must mean that in some profound way we're called to friendship. We're called to relationship. We're called to communion, and I think we see that in Tolkien's writing, particularly in The Lord of the Rings, where friendship factors so highly. I'm going to argue that it even is elevated to an almost sacramental status, kind of riding on the coattails of the discussion of sacramentality in our last chapter. So in Tolkien's own life, friendship featured very prominently. From the Tea Club and Barovian society to the coal-biters to the Inklings, friendly and regularly meeting literary groups were part and parcel of Tolkien's life. And Tolkien once said in a letter that if it were not for the encouragement of his dear friend C.S. Lewis, he doesn't think that The Lord of the Rings would ever have seen the light of day. So that's really saying something, huh? And it kind of makes you wonder, how many other masterpieces are there that never did see the light of day because the creators did not have a C.S. Lewis? They didn't have someone to encourage them. All of us, I think, can tend to be our own worst critic. I think all of us suffer to some degree from imposter syndrome. And so having friends to encourage us is so important as we pursue worthwhile things and try to create something beautiful to share with the world. So there's even a beautiful story from George Sayer. There's an essay. George Sayer was a friend of Tolkien's, and this is great. He talks about how I think it was 1950, Tolkien was kind of at a low point in his life. He didn't think Lord of the Rings was ever going to get published. It was taking him forever. And I think there was just certain things in his personal and professional life that were getting him down. I think Tolkien kind of had a sort of a melancholic personality. And anyway, George Sayer says he had one of those prototype tape recorders, the reel-to-reel things. They had just come out, and somehow he had obtained one. And he went to Tolkien's house. And the first thing Tolkien did was pray the Lord's Prayer in Welsh into the recorder because he wanted to exercise it if you will. He was sure that, the devil was in it. Of course, tongue in cheek. But George Sayer was like, well, why don't you read some of your passages, some of your poetry, some of your passages from Lord of the Rings, And so Tolkien started reading some of his passages, and including the Riddles in the Dark chapter, complete with the Gollum voice. Read the whole chapter. And Tolkien listened back, and he's like, you know what, this is pretty good. Pretty much the whole day went by. And to this day, we have the recordings. I used to play them for my students. Absolutely beautiful. In fact, there was a time when I booted up my laptop, the first thing you would hear was a little MP3 clip of Tolkien saying the road goes ever on and on. And so it's a lot of clips from the Lord of the Rings, a lot of different passages, poems, etc. Anyway, the story is that after Tolkien had that experience listening back to his tape-recorded voice, he's like, this is good. This is good stuff. I can't let this die. Maybe there is an audience for this after all. And it kind of gave him new inspiration, new encouragement to continue with his work. So there's a perfect example of friendship helping Tolkien fulfill his destiny of creating beautiful works of art for the delight and the enjoyment of millions of readers. So Tolkien was a classics scholar, and he was a scholar of medieval myths and languages, incredibly well-read and well-schooled man. So Cicero wrote a classic treatise on friendship. Aristotle named it as an essential feature of the life of happiness in his Nicomachean Ethics. The Hebrew Scriptures praise it frequently throughout the Psalms, and for instance in the friendship between Jonathan and David. The book of Sirach says, a faithful friend is a sturdy shelter, and he who finds one finds a treasure. So as both a classic scholar and a Bible translator, Tolkien would no doubt have been familiar with works like these. The theme of friendship is not an exclusively Christian theme, as we've mentioned. However, the manner in which Tolkien emphasizes friendship is deeply Christian, I'm going to argue. And it transcends these classical formulations, and I would say attains an almost sacramental status. So as discussed in the previous chapter, in the Catholic understanding, a sacrament is a visible mediator of an invisible reality. So it's an efficacious sign which somehow brings about what it signifies. The Church self-identifies as a sacrament. Vatican Council II, for instance, talks about the Church is the universal sacrament of salvation. And not in the sense that it's an eighth sacrament. Catholics believe in 7 sacraments, but it's kind of like the source and the foundation from which flow the other sacraments. Because the Church, again, it's a visible sign of an invisible reality. It's a mediating presence that somehow, for all of its flaws, makes present the person and work of Jesus in the world and in history. Tolkien used the analogy of the wine bottle, the old dusty wine bottle, which for those who can draw old corks still can contain some wine of gladness. So for Tolkien, the Church was a sort of this sacrament, if you will, that mediated the presence of Jesus through his friends, through his people. Even while Christ was still alive and performing his ministry, he started to send out his disciples 2 by 2. And he said to them, he who hears you, hears me. The Church, before it is a building or an institution, or even a body of doctrine or a moral code, is a fellowship. It's Christ present through the unity of believers. It's a network of relationships of people that are moved by Christ. So if you'll permit me to make a little bit of a foray here into some of the Christian underpinnings, then we're going to talk about how they played out in Tolkien's writing. In the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, for instance, so Jesus has ascended into heaven. He tells them to go to Jerusalem and await the promise of the Father, the coming of the Spirit. They don't know exactly what that means, but they listen, they obey. So it says with Mary, they gather in the upper room and they're praying. And I love this scene because they know that Christ is no longer with them. They've seen him ascend bodily into heaven, but they somehow grasp that the new way he's going to be present is through each other. So they no longer have Jesus the way they were accustomed to having him in the flesh and blood, but they've got each other. I love that image of church, a group of faithful people awaiting the promise of the Father, waiting for something cool to happen, clinging to one another in fellowship, and trusting that God's going to do something beautiful and cool in their midst and through their very fellowship and their unity with one another. And so, despite their confusion at Jesus' sudden disappearance, going into heaven, they had each other, and they did what Jesus said. They got together as a group, as a friendship. I've often pointed out to my students in my homilies that, when you read the Gospels carefully, it wasn't just Jesus that captivated the disciples. Obviously, that was the main presence that made everything coalesce. But you get the sense that the way they related to one another was different because of Jesus. Jesus taught them a new way of being with one another. They weren't just business partners, fishing partners anymore. You had Matthew, the tax collector, who was collecting taxes for the hated Romans, and then you had Simon, the zealot, fight the power, bring down the Roman government. Both these guys were part of Jesus' team. So it's amazing that Jesus is able to take this diverse group of people and knit them together into an authentic fellowship that transcends political views, that transcends backgrounds, transcends socioeconomics and regional geographic differences. He brought them together and taught them a new way of being friends with one another in Him. So the apostles, after the ascension, they did not scatter. They didn't go off to seek God in solitude, sort of every man for himself, as each one could make it happen. They clung to each other. And they were aware at some level that in this way the risen Christ would remain present. Nowhere does the New Testament evidence suggest individualism. In fact, quite the opposite is true. God's presence was continually experienced within the unity and abiding friendship of the early believers. Tertullian was an ancient church father. He was a famous early Christian author, and he once reported that even the pagans said of Christians, "See how they love one another." So we see this in Lord of the Rings. See how they love one another. See how Frodo and Sam love one another. See how the members of the fellowship care for one another. Again, one of the alienating stratagems that was so effective for Sauron was divide and conquer. Turn these races, turn these peoples against one another. Whatever you do, don't let them unite. Don't let them coalesce in friendship, because once they do, we're in trouble. Although in The Lord of the Rings, you might see individuals rise to particular acts of heroism, you really don't see individualism in The Lord of the Rings. In fact, when you do see sort of self-isolating behavior, it's in people, for instance, like Gollum, or it's in King Theoden at the behest of Wormtongue. And so we always see that this isolating behavior always ends up leading to bad things, whereas the unification and the coming together in friendship always ends up salutary and beneficial. So now I want to talk about language here for a minute. I want to talk about the particular word that Tolkien used to describe his first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Okay, Tolkien was a linguist, he was a language scholar, and for him words were very, very important. And you have to believe that the words that Tolkien used throughout his book, but particularly to entitle, the three main segments of his work, were very intentionally chosen. And so fellowship is the word used in the King James translation of the Bible and in many subsequent English translations of the Greek word koinonia from the New Testament. This word koinonia is used 19 times in the New Testament, and it was originally a common Greek word denoting joint business partnership. So, such as a shared fishing business. We see this in Luke chapter 5. Peter and his friends had a koinonia, a joint fishing business. However, the word was adopted by the early Christian authors, and it quickly took on deeper theological meaning. And so in the first epistle of St. John, for instance, we read, "That which we have seen and heard, we declare unto you, that you may also have fellowship with us, and truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we write unto you, that your joy may be full." This is the epistle that contains the famous thesis statement, God is love, which implies that love is not something that God merely does, but it's of God's very essence. It's who he is. So as a Trinity, God is a communion of persons. Don't want to get into some big abstract discussion of the Trinitarian theology, but basically what Catholics believe is that God the Father is eternally fathering a Son. He's eternally generating life, and he's pouring everything he is and he has into this Son of his. The eternal Son receives the gift of the Father's love, and he reciprocates that love. He gives it back. So there's this eternal give and take between the Father and the Son. Their love for one another is so intense and real and personal that it's a person. The Holy Spirit is the love between the Father and the Son. So you've got the lover, you've got the beloved, and you've got the love itself. This is kind of the bedrock of Catholic Trinitarian theology. And so John's epistle, if you will, is a summons to enter into the Trinitarian koinonia, the Trinitarian fellowship, through our earthly koinonia, our earthly fellowship. So the idea is that the church, when it's being faithful to what it's supposed to be, when it's actually being church, it is creating, conditions on earth whereby people love the way they love in heaven. It's creating a sort of a visible glimpse on earth of the kind of Trinitarian love and self-giving that we see within God himself. This was the self-understanding of the church from the very beginning, again, going back to these early Christian authors, such as St. John. In the book of Acts, right after the Pentecost event, Peter gives a sermon announcing the good news of Jesus Christ crucified and risen, leading to the conversion and baptism of 3,000 souls. The four main points of subsequent adherence are then mentioned in the text. It says, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, koinonia, and in breaking of bread and in prayers. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, following the ancient tradition of this fourfold structure, is divided into four parts. It's based on that passage from Acts. And so you've got the creed, doctrine, you've got the sacraments, the breaking of the bread, you've got prayer, then you've got morality. And morality is the koinonia, the fellowship. So from this context, we see that the New Testament foundations of the Catechism's very structure imply koinonia, fellowship, as sort of the end game of Christian morality. The commandments promote behaviors conducive to entering into and sustaining true fellowship with God and others. What are the two great commandments that Jesus gives us? Love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. So it's all about love. We might say it's all about friendship, because it's all about learning how to become the kind of person, again, who can enter into and sustain the kind of friendship that is modeled perfectly within the Trinitarian Godhead itself in heaven. So a further step may be taken as we consider parallels between Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring, if you will, and the Church's fellowship. I've got to be careful here because I've said before, Tolkien did not like allegory. Applicability, yes. Allegory, no. So what we're about to say here might sound a little allegorical. I'm not saying it's allegory. Allegory means this is what it means, period. And if you're going to read it correctly, that's the way you have to see it. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that it's suggestive of the text to kind of read it, knowing what we know about Christian morality, Christian doctrine, Christian idea of friendship, that Tolkien had this in the back of his mind, and there's some applicability here. At any rate, the Fellowship of the Ring consists of a wizard, an elf, a dwarf, 2 men, and 4 hobbits. Elrond chose to oppose the Nazgul with the Fellowship, declaring that the company of the ring shall be 9, and the 9 walkers will be set against the 9 riders who are evil. After choosing Gandalf, he insisted that for the rest, they shall represent the other free peoples of the world. So there's this inclusivity that we see in the Fellowship of the Ring. And it evokes the church, frankly. The applicability is noted by Tolkien scholar Bradley Berzer, who draws a parallel between Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn as priest, prophet, and king figures, respectively, adding that Sam may represent the layman, the common man. Kind of a cool interpretation. Again, applicability, not allegory. Burzer even suggests similarities between Gandalf and St. Boniface, the medieval Anglo-Saxon missionary to Germany who helped forge the Triple Alliance between the Anglo-Saxons, the papacy, and the Frankish kingdom that became the Carolingian Empire. According to Burzer, part of Boniface's plan was to create medieval Christendom out of the ruin of Rome and to protect it from the continuous threat of the invading and pagan barbaric tribes. Gandalf's Triple Alliance was to unite hobbits, elves, and men of Numenor. Burzer says, like Gandalf, Boniface refused to operate from any one base of power, but chose the life of a wandering pilgrim instead. So, continuing this theme of Gandalf, we see the view is reinforced when we see Gandalf's standoff with Denethor when they get to Minas Tirith. When they're in the High Court in Minas Tirith, and Gandalf is trying to convince the despairing Denethor to marshal the troops and fight this great battle. After Denethor insists, quote, "There is no purpose higher in the world as it now stands than the good of Gondor," Gandalf responds, "The rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor nor any other, great or small. But all worthy things that are in peril, as the world now stands, those are my care. For I also am a steward. Did you not know?" So Gandalf sees broader and farther than Denethor, whose outlook is marred by a very limited sort of nationalistic isolationism. Gandalf's outlook and mission are universal. He sees the bigger picture and he self-identifies as a steward over all that is good and fair in Middle-earth. This certainly suggests an authority that transcends the merely territorial and political and makes comparisons to a great missionary bishop like Boniface seem kind of appropriate and fitting, if you ask me. As we've previously analyzed in the sacramentality chapter, the pre-Christian Middle-earth that Tolkien presents to us, it removes Christ and any explicitly religious references from the equation. The Christian koinonia, in reality inconceivable apart from Christ, shows up in Tolkien's sub-created fantasy as part of that light from an invisible lamp that we've been talking about many, many times, as said so beautifully in a letter from a fan. The Christian koinonia, I would argue, is kind of like the metronome through which Tolkien conforms the story according to Christian timed rhythms. So with this in mind, we can perhaps appreciate other examples from the story to a greater extent. For instance, in A Conspiracy Unmasked, Frodo is trying to spare Merry and Pippin the danger of the quest. He conceals the true nature of his journey, and he plans to take only Sam with him past the Shire. However, as his close friends, Merry and Pippin know Frodo well, and when Frodo finds out that Sam has told them, he says with some exasperation, "It does not seem I can trust anyone." And Merry responds with this incredibly beautiful passage. He says, "It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick with you through thick and thin, to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours, closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo. Anyway, there it is. We know most of what Gandalf has told you. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we are with you, or following you like hounds." Frodo is deeply happy when he hears these beautiful and comforting words, when he sees how much his friends love him. He says, "Bless you. If the danger were not so dark, I should dance for joy. Even so, I cannot help feeling happy. Happier than I have felt for a long time. I had dreaded this evening." So, and then in The Ring Goes South, after Elrond declares that the Fellowship will be 9, he names 7, but then he's at a loss. "There remain 2 more to be found. These I will consider. Of my household I may find some that it seems good to me to send," he says. At this point, true to the earlier promise, Pippin volunteers himself and Merry, to which Elrond, of course, objects. He says, "That is because you do not understand and cannot imagine what lies ahead." But then Gandalf unexpectedly supports Pippin, and he interjects, "Neither does Frodo, nor do any of us see clearly." He continues, "It is true that if these hobbits understood the danger, they would not dare to go. but they would still wish to go, or wish that they dared, and be shamed and unhappy. I think, Elrond, that in this matter it would be well to trust rather to their friendship than to great wisdom. Even if you chose for us an elf lord, such as Glorfindel, he could not storm the dark tower, nor open the road to the fire by the power that is in him. It would be well to trust rather to their friendship than to great wisdom. This line from Gandalf, I would suggest, can practically serve as his mission statement. Gandalf tirelessly labors to overcome division and alienation by uniting free peoples in friendship for the common purpose of resisting Sauron. Before a bewitched Theoden in the great hall of Edoras, Gandalf proclaims, "Behold, the storm comes, and now all friends should gather together, lest each singly be destroyed." According to an appendix, this was indeed the mission of the wizards, also called the Istari. It says, "It was afterwards said that they came out of the far west and were messengers sent to contest the power of Sauron and to unite all those who had the will to resist him. But they were forbidden to match his power with power or to seek to dominate elves and men by force and fear." So Gandalf remains faithful to his charge, unlike Saruman. Although we once in a while see him using his powers, like to make a nice fireworks display in the Shire or to light the dark way with his staff when they're in the mines of Moria, or to drive off wolves, with some sparks and some fire. His main strength does not lie in magic, if you will. Unlike Saruman, who deemed his own wisdom a justification for his dominance, Gandalf never seeks to dominate other wills. Gandalf's wisdom is shown in his love and respect for freedom. Gandalf relies always on persuasion and not coercion. And he tries to awaken others to accomplish the aims that are going to help Middle-earth. He doesn't seek to dominate them by force or fear. Rather, he tries, like Bilbo, to give them a little nudge out the door, or like he does in Lord of the Rings, to be an alliance builder and help people realize the urgency that the storm is nigh and that all friends must join together lest each singly be destroyed. So Gandalf builds unity. In his true wisdom, he knows that regardless of the unforeseen particulars, friendship will always provide the context for success when the time is finally ripe. In this, he repeatedly is vindicated. He says as much in the Houses of the Healing chapter, after the great battle of the Pelennor Fields in the Return of the King. He tenderly caresses the brow of the recovering Merry before declaring, "He has well repaid my trust. For if Elrond had not yielded to me, neither of you would have set out. And then far more grievous would the evils of this day have been." So again, friendship, it's a common universal human experience. Catholics don't have a monopoly on friendship. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that the overriding emphasis on friendship and just the way that Tolkien weaves friendship into his story, and the way basically that the building of strong friendships and alliances is absolutely critical to the success of the quest. Consider Frodo and Sam. We're going to do a much deeper discussion of them in the next video. Just think about the way how close they grew, as the story progressed. Think about how utterly futile the quest would have been if it hadn't been for Sam being there for Frodo. Imagine if the members of the Fellowship hadn't had each other's back. Imagine if Gandalf hadn't sacrificed himself for his friends on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm when they're facing the terror of the Balrog. Gandalf, for all he knew, he was the only one that could really have led them. But he also knew that he was the only one that had a chance to stand up to the Balrog. So he went out there and he sacrificed himself for the sake of his friends. We see the same thing when Aragorn goes to seek the paths of the dead. A very uncertain fate, which thankfully ended up working out okay. But people sacrificing for their friends, again, in the Bible, Jesus says in the Last Supper, "You are my friends. I no longer call you my servants, I call you my friends," he says to his disciples, "because I've revealed to you everything that I've heard from my Father. No one has greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. And of course, Jesus is about to prove that statement. He's about to walk his talk, as the next day on Good Friday, he himself will prove the ultimate friend who lays down his life for us. So I think that friendship is one of the most beautiful aspects of the Lord of the Rings. In fact, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a true friend from this book. I find myself very often asking, well, what would Gandalf do? What would Strider do? What would Sam do? I strive in my life to try to one day become the kind of friend that Sam was to Frodo. You know, as a priest, as a pastor, I strive to one day be the kind of unity builder, alliance builder, the kind of person who can overcome alienation and bring people together in common purpose against the evils we're facing in our world, united under the banner of Christ, in my case, as a priest. Gosh, one of these days, I'll never have the long, flowing white hair. I might be able to grow the beard, but man, I want to be like Gandalf when I grow up. So friendship, it's amazing. It gives us some of the most beautiful and heartwarming scenes and passages in all of the Lord of the Rings. So I hope this discussion on friendship in general has been enlightening for you. That's going to be all for today. In the next video, we're going to discuss the friendship between Sam and Frodo. We're going to discuss Sam as kind of the model friend. And we're going to show through many passages how Sam fulfills the role of friend in a most exemplary way. And really so much so that Tolkien calls him in one of his letters the chief hero of the story. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.